He wanted readers simply to be able to say, "This is a capital quotation for, say, heaven, or half, or hug, or handful. It illustrates the meaning or use of the word. It is a suitable instance for a dictionary." Follow that kind of thinking, Murray insisted, and you will not go too far wrong. William Minor read and clearly understood all of this. He looked about his library cell, scanning the volumes in the astonishing collection that he had already accumulated over the previous 10 years. He took out the list of books that had come with Murray's original pamphlet. He would see first if he had any on his shelves that might in time become useful. All of a sudden his books, which had hitherto been merely a fond decoration and a means of letting his mind free itself from the grim routines of Broadmoor life, had become his most precious possession. For the time being, at least, he could set aside his imaginings about the harm that people were trying to inflict on him and his person. It was instead his hundreds of books that now needed to be kept safe, and away from the predators with whom he believed the asylum to be infested. His books, and his work on the words he found in them, were about to become the defining feature of his newly chosen life. For the next 20 years he would do almost nothing at Broadmoor except enfold himself and his tortured brain in the world of his books, their writings, and their words. He was maverick enough, original-minded enough, however, to realize that he could do better than simply follow Murray's orders to the letter. Given his peculiar position, his leisure, his library, he could do more, do otherwise. It took him some days of pondering exactly how he might best serve the project, but after some weeks of thinking he came up with what he thought was the best way to tackle the task. He made a decision. He took down from his shelves the first of his books and laid it open flat on his reading desk. We cannot be sure which book it was. For sake of illustration, though, let us say the first volume, and which we know he had and used, was a leather-bound, gold and marble-edged translation of a French book called Complete Woman, by one Jacques Dubosc. Published in London in 1639, it had been translated by a man identified only as N.N. His arguments for starting with this in particular, and indeed for reading it at all, were many. It was a good 17th-century work. It was obscure and exotic. It was filled, no doubt, with strange and amusing words. After all, Murray had exhorted his volunteers to examine this specific period of literary history. The 17th century, with so many more writers, naturally shows still more unexplored territory. Dubosc's book, in its anonymous translation, fitted the bill splendidly. So Minor took from a drawer 4 sheets of white paper and a bottle of black ink, and he selected a pen with the very finest nib. He folded the paper into a quire, a booklet, 8 pages thick. Then, with perhaps one last glance down from his cell window at the lush countryside below, he settled in to read his chosen book, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, with slow and infinitely measured care. As he did so, he began a routine that he'd planned during his early days of preparation. Each and every time he found a word that piqued his interest, he wrote it down in tiny, almost microscopic letters, in its proper position in the quire he had made. The unique manner of his procedure was soon to become a hallmark of Minor's astonishing accuracy and eye for detail. His work would win the admiration and awe of all who were later to see it. Even today, the quires preserved in the dictionary archives are such as to make people gasp. Let us choose, as an example, the moment when he came across the word buffoon. He was first struck by the significance of its appearance, in a suitably illustrative sentence, on Dubosc's page 34. He promptly wrote it down in his tiny, perfectly neat, perfectly legible handwriting, on the first page of his blank booklet. He wrote it in the first column, and decided to place the word and its page number in the column about a third of the way down. The placement was precise, and it was carefully chosen. The reason for this was Minor's certainty that sooner or later he would find another interesting word beginning with the same letter, B. that there was a very good chance it would have to be put before buffoon, and only a very much slimmer chance that it would need to be put after. Because with buffoon's second letter being U, there were only three possibilities: finding a further word or words whose second letter was again U, or one with the only other legitimate second letters W, with only one word, wana, or Y. Sure enough, a few pages later he came across the interesting word bulk, with a nice quotation, and so deserving to be entered in the choir. He placed it on the list above buffoon, but with enough space in the event that another B word came along whose second letter was somewhere in the alphabet between the new A and the old U. 5 pages further on he then cited with some pleasure the word blab, a word of the very kind he had anticipated, and so in it went, levered into the space that he had so artfully retained below bulk and well above buffoon. And thus did the word list for the first of Dr. Minor's cellful of books begin, word after word after word, each one with its spelling exact, its location in the choir perfectly appropriate, the page number where it was to be found in the source book precise. From atom and azure to gust and hearten, fix and foresight. The list went on and on. Some of the words occurred many times. Feel, for example, which Minor recorded as cropping up on 16 of Dubosc's pages, although some of these turned out to be feeling, either the gerund, as in I can't help feeling this way, or the noun, as with the feeling of which you speak is painful. It must have taken him many weeks, perhaps months, to complete this first word list. Perhaps it was well into the year 1883 by the time he'd finished it. But even though fully 4 years had now elapsed since James Murray had sent out his first appeal pamphlet, and more than 3 years since the first nudge to American readers in the Athenaeum magazine, and a year, maybe 2, since Minor had read one or other of the appeals and had decided to become involved, he still had not sent one single quotation slip down to the scriptorium. For all the staff of the dictionary knew, he had lost interest, become overwhelmed, dropped out. But nothing could have been further from the truth. Dr. Minor, in fact, had quite another plan of attack, a working method that turned out to be very different from that of all other volunteer readers, but that soon marked him as uniquely valuable in the making of the great dictionary. For once he'd completed the monumental task of writing his first word list from his first book, he replaced that volume and took down another. Perhaps his next was Francis Junius, The Painting of the Ancients, from 1638, or Thomas Wilson's The Rule of Reason, from 1551, or perhaps something quite different. It could have been any one of hundreds of books, for he had a prodigious collection, and it would be his practice to select one, then another, and then yet another, and write a new word list for each one. One book might take him 3 months to complete, in the kind of detail he felt his distant editors would demand. And so he would work away, day after day, the tiny spy window in his door clicking open and shut every hour or so from the outside, as the Broadmoor attendants checked on the safety and the existence of their strange patient. He would be working hard, deep in thought, and with rapt concentration. He would index and collect and collate words and sentences from each of the books, until his prison desk was heavy with the quires of paper, each one containing a master list of the indexed words from his eclectic, very valuable, and much valued little gem of a library. Although we cannot be sure which of his books he read first, we do know the titles of some of the books that he did read. Most of them, it turns out, reflect his keenly forlorn interest in travel and history. One can only imagine how his poor mind must have raced, trapped as it was in his book-lined retreat on the top floor of his cell block. How frustrated and pinioned he must have felt, reading line after line of such books as the one by Thomas Herbert, written in 1634, titled A Relation of Some Years' Travail begun Anno 1626 into Afrique and the Greater Asia. One can only suspect how homesick Miner must have felt for Trincomalee and his native girls on reading and indexing Nicholas Litchfield's 1582 translation of Fernão Lopes de Castaneda's first book of the history of the discovery and conquest of the East Indies. One by one his collection of carefully assembled word leaflets mounted up. By the autumn of 1884 he had enough of them, a large enough selection of words for which he had readily accessible quotations, to begin inquiring of the dictionary editors, and Murray himself in particular, which catchwords precisely were then needed. For while all the other volunteers would simply read their assigned books, note down interesting quotations on their slips of paper as they came across them, and send them off in bundles, Dr. Miner, with all the time on his hands, was able to extrapolate on his radically different, home-grown approach. With his rapidly growing collection of word lists and his indexes, he stood ready now to help the dictionary project as it needed to be helped, by sending over quotations at the precise time the editors needed them. He could keep up, he could be abreast of the progress of the dictionary all the while, because he had ready access to the words that were needed when they were wanted. He'd made a key, a Victorian word Rolodex, a dictionary within a dictionary, and it was instantly available. The quires of lists on his plain wooden table represented an accumulated creation, of which he was quite rightly and jealously proud. His practice was first to write to the dictionary and ask what letter or what word was being worked on. Then, on receiving a reply, he would refer to his own index quires to see if it already noted down the wanted word. If he had, and given his method and his wide and energetic reading it was more than likely that he had, he would follow his own notation of the page number or numbers, and go straight to the words appearance or appearances in one of his books. Then, and only then, he would transcribe the best sentence containing the word onto a ready-made quotation slip, and send it directly to the scriptorium. It was an unprecedented approach, a kind of technique that only someone with an immense amount of energy and disposable time could contemplate. And, of course, it was a technique that suited the editors famously. They knew now that down at this mysteriously anonymous address in Crowthorne, in all probability they had on tap, as it were, a supply of fully indexed words, together with their associated citations and quotations. With the arrival of Miner's first letter, saying what he'd done and how ready he was for further inquiry, Murray's hard-pressed staff discovered that life had become, in theory, very much simpler. From this moment forward, they were not obliged only to ferret through their shelves and pigeonholes, and to trawl through thousands of existing slips for quotations that might or might not exist for a word they wanted to include. They could simply decide on a word that was giving them problems, write to Crowthorne, and ask for it. With good fortune, and with a high statistical likelihood, they would in due course receive a letter and a package from Dr. Miner, giving the precise chapter and verse for whatever was wanted, enclosing the quotation slips at the very instant they were needed to be pasted onto a page for the compositors, the typesetters, and the printers. The first word to be tried in this way was a deceptively simple one, to the extent that any individual word is simple compared to any other. It was a word that was due to be included in the dictionary's second fascicle, or part, being readied to be printed and published in the later summer of 1885. Please inspect your word lists, wrote a sub-editor, to see if you can find in them references to the word art and to all its derived forms. The letter went directly to Dr. Miner at Broadmoor, as his invitational letter had suggested. Whichever of Murray's sub-editors first asked him the question, in reply, had no ideas about the man from whom an answer was sought. For many years thence, no one in the scriptorium was to learn anything about him, except for the undeniable truth that he was very good at his job, very quick, and on his way to becoming an indispensable member of the great new dictionary team. Art was to be his first test. Chapter 8. Annulated Art. Brick Tea. buckwheat. Poor, adjective, SB, forms A, 3 to 5, poer, pover, 3 to 6, poor, pover, 4, poier, poiur, puer, 4 to 5, poer, power, 5, poier, 5 to 6, power, 6, power, beta, 3 to 5, poor, 4 to 6, power, 4, gamma, 3 to 7, minus 9 dial, 4, 4 to 7, poor, double O, 6, 7, poor, P-O-O-R, delta, SC and North dialect, 4 to 6, poor, P-U-R, 4 to 8, P-U-R-E, 4, P-U-Y-R-E, 5, P-W-Y-R, P-O-Y-R, 6, per, P-E-U-R, E, puer, pure, 6, pure, U, with an umlaut, 9, pier, Middle English, pover, puer, poor, adjective, Old French, pauvre, pauvrer, poor, in Modern French, pauvre, dialect, poor, pauvre, poor, equals PR, pobre, poor, Italian, povero, Spanish, PG, pobre, Latin, pauper, late Latin also pauperus, poor. The Mod English poor and SC pure represent the Middle English poor. With modern vulgar poor, P-O-R-E, compare whore and the pronunciation of door, floor. On account of the ambiguity of the letter U and its variant V before 1600, it is uncertain whether Middle English P-O-U-E-R-E, poor, P-O-U-E-R, meant poo or pov. The phonetic series, paupere, M, paupra, popra, pobra, povra, shows that povra preceded poor, which may have been reached in late Old French, and is of the form in various modern French dialects. But the 15th and early 16th century literary French form was pauvre, P-O-V-R-E, artificially spelt in 15th century P-A-U-V-R-E, after Latin pauper, and Middle English poor, source of modern English poor. Seems to have been reduced from pauvre, like o'er from over, lord from lovebird. Compare also portith, poor rail, poverty. But some English dialects now have poor, P-O-U-R, pronounced P-A-U-R, which probably represents Middle English, poor, pure. 1. 1. Having few or no material possessions. Wanting means to procure the comforts or the necessaries of life. Needy, indigent, destitute, specifically, especially in legal use, so destitute as to be dependent upon gifts or allowances for subsistence. In common use, expressing various degrees, from absolute want to straitened circumstances, or limited means relatively to station, as a poor gentleman, a poor professional man, clergyman, scholar, clerk, etc. The opposite of rich or wealthy. Poor people, the poor as a class, often with connotation of humble rank or station. 6. Such or so circumstanced as to excite one's compassion or pity, unfortunate, hapless, now chiefly colloquial. In many parts of England regularly said of the dead whom one knew, equals late, deceased. The first slips of snow-white unlined paper, 6 inches by 4, and covered with William Minor's neat, elaborately cursive and so distinctively American handwriting, in greenish-black ink, began to drift out from the Broadmoor post-room in the spring of 1885. By the late summer they were arriving at their destination in small brown paper packets every month, and then larger packets every week. Before long, the gentle shower of paper had turned into a raging blizzard, one that was to howl up from Crowthorne unceasingly for almost all of the next 20 years. Paper slips were not, however, sent to Mill Hill. By the time Dr. Minor had begun to engage in the second stage of his work, contributing the quotations rather than amassing the lists, James Murray and his team had all moved up to Oxford. The editor had been persuaded to give up his comfortable job as a schoolteacher, and despite the poor pay and the interminable hours, he had taken the plunge into full-time lexicography. This was in spite of a general mood of malaise and wretchedness. Murray's experiences with the first years of work on the big dictionary were far from happy, and many were the times he had vowed to resign. The delegates at the press were parsimonious and interfering. The pace of work was proving insufferably slow. His health was suffering from the interminable hours, his monomaniacal devotion to an almost impossible task. But then there was one sustaining fact. The first of the fascicles, the revenue-producing instalments into which Oxford insisted that the dictionary be divided, had at last been published on January the 29th, 1884. Nearly 5 years had elapsed since James Murray had been appointed editor. 27 years had passed since Richard Chenevix Trench had given his famous address, in which he called for a new English dictionary. Now, in a muddy off-white cover, and with its sheets half uncut, was the first part, 352 pages worth, of all the known English words, from A to Ant, published by the Clarendon Press, Oxford, at a price of 12 shillings and sixpence. Here at last was the first morsel of substance, part 1 of A New English Dictionary on Historical Principles, founded mainly on the materials collected by the Philological Society, edited by James A. H. Murray, LL.D., sometime president of the Philological Society, with the assistance of many scholars and men of science. Murray could not help but be proud. The problems that seemed so insuperable, and that so pressed down on him, would tend to vanish whenever he held the flimsy, paper-covered volume in his hand. And in a sudden sunburst of birthday eve optimism, the editor, he would be 47 in less than a week, declared that he now felt confident in predicting that the final part would be published in 11 years' time. It was, in fact, to take another 44. But now, after all the years of waiting, the interested world could at least see the magnificent complexity of the undertaking, the detail, the filigree work, the sheer intricacies of exactitude that the editors were bent on compiling. Those in England could write and receive a copy for 12 shillings and sixpence. Those in the United States received a fascicle printed in Oxford, but published by Macmillan in New York for $3.25. The first part's first word, once the 4 pages devoted to the simple letter A had been accounted for, was the obsolete noun AA, meaning a stream or a watercourse. There was a quotation supporting its existence from a work of 1430, which had a reference to the still rather damp and water-girt Lincolnshire town of Saltfleetby, in which, 4 centuries earlier, there had been a rivulet known locally as Le Seven Town Ah. The first properly current word in the fascicle was Aal, A-A-L, a Bengali or Hindi name for a plant related to the madder, from which a dye could be extracted and used to colour clothes. Andrew Ure's 1839 Dictionary of Arts, Manufactures and Mines provided the authority. He has obtained from the Aal root a pale yellow substance which he calls morindin. And then the first properly English word. If a linguist might quibble, there ever is such a thing, it was to be aardvark, a half armadillo, half anteater that lives in sub-Saharan Africa and has a sticky 2-foot tongue. 3 quotations are offered, the earliest from 1833. Thus does the vast emporium of words begin to display itself, through acatalectic and adhesion, via agnate and alumine, to animal, answer, and finally to ant. By that last, Murray's team meant a great deal more than simply the small social insect of the Hymenopterous order. There is also the contraction for ain't, a rare prefix meaning anti, as with antacid, and more commonly the suffix derived from the French for sometimes, and appended to make words like tenant, valiant, claimant, and pleasant. 350 pages of scholarly amassment, the first pages of what would in more than 4 decades' time swell to no fewer than 15,487. It was in the new scriptorium in Oxford that Dr. Murray was to do all future work on the dictionary. He and Ada and their considerable family, 6 sons and 5 daughters, had moved there in the summer of 1884, 6 months after A to Ant. They'd taken a large house on what were then the northern outskirts of the city, at 78 Banbury Road. It was called Sunnyside. The house, large and comfortable in the manner of North Oxford, which is a sedate settling ground for the university's greater dons and lesser institutes, exists still, together with the red pillar box that the post office erected outside, to swallow up the immense amounts of outgoing letters. Today the house is occupied by a popular anthropologist, and he's changed it little enough on the outside. Only the scriptorium, the scrippy, as the Murray family knew it, which Murray's own dictionary defines as the room in a religious house set apart for the copying of manuscripts, has gone. Perhaps not surprisingly, no one, even in Victorian times, much liked the iron and corrugated tin construction, 15 feet by 50, that was put up in the back garden. The next-door neighbour said it spoiled his view, and so Murray had it sunk into a 3-foot-deep trench, which made it damp and cold for the staff, and produced a huge bank of discarded earth that offended the neighbours even more. When it was finished, people said it looked like a tool shed, a stable, or a wash-house, and those who laboured in it cursed the monkish asceticism of its construction and its irredeemably bone-chilling cold, and called it a horrid corrugated den. But it was 20 feet longer than the Mill Hill scriptorium, which does still exist, an annex to the library of what is still a costly and fashionable school, and the arrangements for filing, sorting, and then using the incoming quotation slips, which by now were flooding in at the rate of more than 1,000 each day, were much improved. There were 1,029 pigeonholes built at first. Coleridge had just 54. Then banks of shelves were built, as the volume and the sheer weight of slips became unmanageably large. Long and well-polished mahogany tables supported the texts selected for the word of the day or the hour, and large churchly lecterns held up the main dictionaries and reference books, to which Murray and his men made constant reference. The leader himself had placed his seat and desk on a dais back in the Mill Hill days. Here at Oxford there was a more democratically level floor, but Murray's stool was taller than the rest, and he presided from it still with unchallenged authority, seeing all, missing little. He organized the workings of the scriptorium as might an officer on a battlefield. The slips were the peculiar province of the Quartermaster Corps, of which Murray was Quartermaster General. The packages would come in each morning, 1,000 or so slips a day. One reader would check quickly to see if the quotation was full and all words were spelled properly. Then a second, often one of Murray's children, each of whom was employed almost as soon as he or she was literate, paid 6pence a week for half an hour a day, and rendered precociously crossword capable, would sort the contents of each bundle into the catchwords' alphabetical order. A third worker would then divide the catchwords into their various recognized parts of speech: bell as noun, bell as adjective, bell as verb, for instance. And then a fourth employee would see that the quotations assembled for each were arranged chronologically. Then a sub-editor, one of the more exalted members of the team, would subdivide the meanings of each word into the various shades it had enjoyed over its lifetime. Also at this point, if he had not done so earlier, he would make a first stab at writing that most crucial feature of most dictionaries, the definition. Defining words properly is a fine and peculiar craft. There are rules. A word, to take a noun as an example, must first be defined according to the class of things to which it belongs, mammal, quadruped, and then differentiated from other members of that class, bovine, female. There must be no words in the definition that are more complicated or less likely to be known than the word being defined. The definition must say what something is and not what it is not. If there is a range of meanings of any one word, cow having a broad range of meanings, cower having essentially only one, then they must be stated, and all the words in the definition must be found elsewhere in the dictionary. A reader must never happen upon a word in the dictionary that he or she cannot discover elsewhere in it. If the definer contrives to follow all these rules, stirs into the mix an ever-pressing need for concision and elegance, and if he or she is true to the task, a proper definition will probably result. By now, the words from the envelope of quotations would have been assembled into the smallest of subgroups, each with a stated meaning and a definition, either just written by a junior or written some time before when the word was in a half-completed state. It simply remained now to divide these subgroups chronologically, so as to demonstrate, with the army of quotations, just how the shades of meaning of the catchword had altered and evolved over its lifespan. Once this was done, Murray would take the collections of slips for each of the subgroups for any distinct and defined target word, and arrange or rearrange, or further subdivide them as he saw fit. He would write and insert the word's etymology, which Oxford, despite the existence of its own etymological dictionary, did in the end see fit to allow Murray to include, and its pronunciation, a tricky decision, and one likely to provoke, as it has, ceaseless controversy, and then make a final selection of the very best quotations. Ideally, there should be at least one sentence from the literature for each century in which the word was used, unless it was a very fast-changing word that needed more quotations to suggest the speed of its new shadings. Finally, with that all squared away, Murray would write the concise, scholarly, accurate, and lovingly elegant definition for which the dictionary is well known, and send the finished columns over to the press. It would be set in a Clarendon or an old-style typeface, or in Greek or other foreign or Old English or Anglo-Saxon face when needed, and returned to the scriptorium, printed in galley. It was ready to be set onto a page, and the page made into a form for placing on the great letterpress engines in the stone printing works down in the back of Walton Street. Murray was no whiner, but his letters tell a great deal about the difficulty of the task he'd set himself, and that the publishers, who wanted to see a return on their investment, in turn had set him. The expressed hope was that 2 parts, 600 pages of finished dictionary, might be published each year. Murray himself tried gallantly to complete work on 33 words every day, and yet often a single word, like approve, takes 3/4 of a day itself. Murray spoke of the trials of the work in his presidential address to the Philological Society, and a subsequent Athenaeum article in March 1884, an article that led to his first real contact with William Minor. He referred to the difficulty of pushing our way experimentally through an untrodden forest where no white man's axe has been before us. Only those who have made the experiment know the bewilderment with which editor or sub-editor, after he has apportioned the quotations for such a word as above among 20, 30, or 40 groups, and furnished each of these with a provisional definition, spreads them out on a table or on the floor where he can obtain a general survey of the whole, and spends hour after hour in shifting them about like pieces on a chessboard, striving to find in the fragmentary evidence of an incomplete historical record such a sequence of meanings as may form a logical chain of development. Sometimes the quest seems hopeless. Recently, for example, the word art utterly baffled me for several days. Something had to be done with it. Something was done and put in type. But the renewed consideration of it in print, with the greater facility of reading and comparison which this afforded, led to the entire pulling to pieces and reconstruction of the edifice, extending to several columns of type. It was at about this time, when Murray was so very vexed over art, that one of his sub-editors, or perhaps it was Murray himself, wrote the first official request to Broadmoor. They wanted Dr. Minor to find out if he had earmarked any quotations for art that suggested other meanings, or which came from earlier dates, than had been assembled so far. 16 distinct shades of meaning had been uncovered for the noun. Perhaps Minor had some more, or some further illumination of the word. If so, then he, and anyone else for that matter, should kindly send them back to Oxford post-haste. 18 letters duly came in about the word from a variety of readers who had seen the article. One of the replies, undeniably the most fruitful, came from Broadmoor. In comparison with all other readers who had offered merely one sentence or two, the unsung Dr. Minor had enclosed no fewer than 27. He struck his sub-editors in Oxford as not only a meticulous man, he was also very prolific and able to tap deep into wells of knowledge and research. The dictionary team had made a rare find. It has to be said that most of Minor's quotations for this particular word came from a somewhat obvious source. Sir Joshua Reynolds' famous Discourses, written in 1769, the year after he became President of the Royal Academy. But they were of inestimable value to the dictionary makers, and as proof, there today, standing as a mute memorial to the beginnings of his work, is the first known quotation that William Chester Minor had placed in the finished book. It is the second quotation under the sense, the arts, and it reads simply, 1769, Reynolds, Sir J, Disc 1 Works, 1870, 306. There is a general desire among our nobility to be distinguished as lovers and judges of the arts. Unwittingly, Sir Joshua's words were to provide the starting point for a relationship between Dr. Murray and Dr. Minor that would combine sublime scholarship, fierce tragedy, Victorian reserve, deep gratitude, neutral respect, and a slowly growing amity that could even, in the loosest sense, be termed friendship. Whatever it was called, it was a link that would last the two men until death finally separated them 30 years later. The work Dr. Minor did for the dictionary, and which began with Reynolds' Discourses, continued for the next 2 decades, but some stronger bond than a simple love of words had also been forged, and it was one that kept these two so different elderly men intimately connected for half as long again. It was to be 7 years before they met, however. During that time, Minor began to send out his quotations at a prodigious rate. At times, many more than 100 new slips every week, as many as 20 a day, all in a neat, firm hand. He would write to Murray, always rather formally, straying only rarely into matters that were not within his self-appointed purview. The first correspondence that survives, from October 1886, was largely about agricultural matters. Perhaps the doctor, taking a break from his work at the table, had stood up to stretch, and had gazed wistfully from his cell window down at the farm labourers in the valley below, watching them stacking the late autumn sheaves and drinking warm cider under the oaks. He refers in his letter to a book he is reading called The Country Farm by Gervase Markham, published in 1616, and to occurrences of the verb bell, as when the ripening hops swell out in bell shapes in late August. Light, too, catches his attention, as well as blast, and then heckling, which on farms once meant the process of separating the individual stems of the flax plant from each other, and only later became used, often in a political context, in the sense of catechizing someone, making his or her arguments stand up to severe scrutiny, as a flax plant might stand when divided for the scutcher. He likes the word buckwheat, too, and its French translation, blé noir, and finds such niceties as ointment of buckwheat. He clearly revels in his work. One can almost feel him squirming with something akin to teenage excitement, as he offers, "I could give you more if you wanted," and as a teasing bonus, throws in a small temptation on the thoroughly amusing word horsebread. He signs off, seeming to will a response from the great man on the grate outside. "I trust same may be useful to you. Very truly yours, W.C. Minor, Broadmoor, Crowthorne, Berks." The tone of this and other such letters as survive seems halfway between the obsequious and the detached, dignified and controlled on the one hand, and leavened with Uriah Heep-like toadying on the other. Minor wants desperately to know that he is being helpful. He wants to feel involved. He wants, but knows he can never demand, that praise be showered on him. He wants respectability, and he wants those in the asylum to know that he is special, different from others in their cells. Though he has no idea at all of his correspondent's character or circumstances, thinking him still a practical medical man of literary tastes with a good deal of leisure, Murray seems to recognize something of his pleading tone. He notices, for instance, the curious way Minor seems to prefer to work on those words that are current, like art first, and then blast and buckwheat, and that are in the process of being placed into the succession of pages, parts, and volumes of the moment. Murray notes in a letter to a colleague that Minor clearly very much wants to stay up to date, that unlike most other readers, he has no interest in working on words that are destined for volumes and letters to be published years and decades hence. The editor writes later that he feels Minor clearly wants to be able to feel involved, to enjoy the impression that he, Minor, is somehow a part of the team, doing things in tandem with the scribes up at the scriptorium. Minor was none too far from Oxford after all. Perhaps he felt as though he were at a detached college, like St. Catherine's Society or Mansfield Hall, and that his cells, or what James Murray still thought of as his comfortable book-lined brown study, were just a rurally detached edition of the scriptorium, a den of scholarly creation and lexical detective work. Had anyone chosen to ponder further, he or she might have wondered at the strange symmetry of the two men's settings, pinioned as each was among great stacks of books, single-mindedly devoted to learning of the most recondite kind, each man's only outlet his correspondence, in great daily storms of paper and floods of ink. Except there was a difference. William Minor remained profoundly and irreversibly mad. The Broadmoor attendants had noticed some improvement in the very early 1880s, when he first replied to the appeal from Mill Hill. But as the years went on, and as Minor passed dejected and alone through the milestone of his 50th birthday in June 1884, his elderly stepmother having visited him the month before on her way home to the United States from Ceylon, where she had stayed since her husband's death. So the old ills returned, reinvigorated, reinforced. "Dear Dr. Orange," he writes to the Broadmoor superintendent at the beginning of next September, "the defacement of my books still goes on. It is simply certain that someone besides myself has access to them and abuses it." His handwriting is shaky, uncertain. He heard his cell door opening at 3 a.m. the night before, he says, and goes on, raving, "The sound of that door, as you may verify, since the alteration is unmistakable, and you could be as morally sure of its closure by the sound as of anything you do not really see. If he has no other remedy, he warns, I shall have to send my books back to London and have them sold. Thankfully, this small tantrum was short-lived. Had it continued or worsened, the dictionary might have lost one of its closest and most valuable friends. A month later, a new obsession grips him. Dear Dr. Orange, let me mention one fact that falls in with my hypothesis. So many fires have occurred in the U.S., originating quite inexplicably in the interspace of ceiling and floor, that I learn now insurance companies refuse to insure large buildings, mills, factories, which have the usual hollow spacing under the floor. They insist upon solid floors. All this has come to notice within 10 years, but no one suggests any explanation. Except Dr. Miner, that is. Fiends have been creeping about in the interstices between floors and ceilings, and have wrought mischief and committed crimes, not least in Broadmoor, where they hide and crawl out at night, to abuse the poor doctor nightly, mark his books, steal his flute, and torture him cruelly. The hospital, he says, must have solid floors built in, otherwise no fire insurance, and a host of nightly misdeeds. The daily reports flow in a kind of seamless syrup of insanity. 4 cakes stolen, his flute gone, his books all marked. He himself frog-marched up and down the corridor by attendants James and Annette. The daily reports flow in a kind of seamless syrup of insanity. 4 cakes stolen, his flute gone, his books all marked. He himself frog-marched up and down the corridor by attendants James and Annette. A spare key used at night to allow villagers into his rooms to abuse him and his possessions. Dr. Miner, in his drawers and shirt, stockings and slippers, complaining that small pieces of wood were forced into his lock, that electricity was used on his body, that a murderous lot had beaten him during the night and had left a savage pain all along his left side. Scoundrels came to his room. Attendant Coles came at 6 a.m. and used my body. It is a very dirty business, he screamed one morning, standing now only in his drawers, that a fellow cannot sleep without Coles coming in like that. Again, as before, he made a pimp of me. And yet, as came the madness, so came the words. Many of those that fascinated him were Anglo-Indian, reflecting his birthplace. There were bang, brinjal, catamaran, cholera, chunam, and kucheri. He liked brick tea. By the time of the middle 1890s he became very active, working on the letter D, and though there are some Hindustani words like dubash, duba, and dobi, he was interested also in what were regarded as the core words of the dictionary, and contributions of quotations are in the Oxford archives for such words as delicately, directly, dirt, disquiet, drink, duty, and die. He was able more often than not to supply the quotation for the first use of a word, always an occasion for celebration. For the use of the word dirt, meaning earth, he quotes from John Fryer's New Account of East Indies and Persia, published in 1698. For one meaning of magnificence, for one of model, for reminiscence, and for spalt, a foolish person. The first work by Du Bosq also provided ideal material. The dictionary staff at Oxford noticed only one small and strange rhythm to Miner's frantic pace, but in the high summertime rather fewer packages would come. Perhaps, they speculated innocently, Dr. Miner liked to spend the warm days outside, away from his books. A reasonable explanation indeed. But when the autumn came around again, and the evening began to darken, so he began working ceaselessly again, replying to every request, asking repeatedly and anxiously about the progress of the work, and inundating the team with ever more packages of slips, more quotations even than were needed. One could wish that Dr. Miner had made about half the number of references, wrote Murray to another editor, overwhelmed. But indeed one never really knows what words will come of use till one comes to deal with the word lexicographically. Because his method of working was very different from everyone else's, it is more difficult to make a quantitative comparison, to set the numerical achievement of his work against that of the other great contributors. Perhaps at the end of the project he had actually sent in no more than 10,000 slips, which sounds a fairly modest number. But as virtually all of them proved to be useful, and because every one of them was wanted and had been ordered, so his achievement as a contributor more than equals the effort achieved by some others in sending 10,000 slips a year. The Oxford team was indeed grateful. The preface to the first completed volume, Volume 1, A to B, when finished in 1888, a full 9 years after the project was begun, contains a one-line mention. It might as well have been a page of fulsome thanks, and it made their contributors supremely proud, not least because it was, by happenstance, discreet enough to offer no hint to others of his strange situation. It said simply and elegantly, Dr. W.C. Minor of Crowthorne. Grateful though they might have been, the Oxford team was also becoming, as time went on, very, very puzzled, and Murray was more puzzled than all of them. Who exactly was this brilliant, strange, exacting man? They asked one another. Murray attempted fruitlessly to inquire. Crowthorne was less than 40 miles from Oxford, an hour by the Great Western Railway via Reading. How was it that Minor, so distinguished and energetic a man, and so much a neighbour, was never to be seen? How could there be a man of such lexicographical skills, who had so much leisure and energy and lived so very close, and who yet never seemed to want to see the temple to which he sent so many thousands of offerings? Where was the man's curiosity? What was his pleasure? Was he somehow unwell, disabled, frightened? Could it be that he felt intimidated by the company of great Oxford men like these? The answer to the deepening mystery came about in a curious manner. It was delivered to Dr. Murray by a passing scholar-librarian, who stopped by at the scriptorium in 1889 to talk about more serious matters. In the course of a talk that ranged across the entire spectrum of lexicography, he made a chance reference to the Crowthorne doctor. How kind the good James Murray had evidently been to him, remarked the scholar. How good you've been to our poor Dr. Minor. There was a startling pause, and the sub-editors and secretaries in the scriptorium, who had overheard the conversation, suddenly stopped in their tracks. As one, they looked up toward where their leader and his visitor were sitting. "Poor Dr. Minor?" asked Murray, as perplexed as any one of those who were now keenly listening. "What can you possibly mean?" Chapter 9. The Meeting of Minds. Dénouement, French, dénouement formerly dénouement, from dénouer, dénouer with an S in Old French, désnouer, to untie, equals dénosar, Italian, disnodare, a Romanic formation from Latin dis plus nodare, to knot, nodus, knot. Unraveling, spec, the final unraveling of the complications of a plot in a drama, novel, etc. The catastrophe. Transf, the final solution or issue of a complication, difficulty, or mystery. Modern literary myth maintains, even today, that the strangest puzzle surrounding William Chester Minor's career was this. Just why did he not attend the great dictionary dinner? A dinner to which he was invited, held in Oxford on the glittering evening of Tuesday, October the 12th, 1897. It was Queen Victoria's Jubilee year, and those who were connected with the OED project were in more than a mood for a party. The dictionary was at long last going well. The faltering progress of the early years was now accelerating. The farcical anta, to battening, had been published in 1885, Batently to Bosom in 1887, Bra to Baizen in 1888. A new spirit of efficiency had settled on the scriptorium, and as crowning glory Queen Victoria had, in 1896, graciously agreed, as the court liked to say, that the just completed Volume 3, embracing the entirety of the infuriating letter C, which the lexicographers found unusually filled with ambiguities and complexities, not least because of its frequent overlaps with the letters G, K, and S, should be dedicated to her. An aura of majestic permanence had all of a sudden invested the dictionary. There was no doubt now that it would eventually be completed, for since it had been royally approved, who could ever brook its cancellation? With that happy realization, and with the Queen having done her part, so Oxford, in high mood for celebration, decided it could follow suit. James Murray deserved to be given honours and thanks, and who more appropriate than the great man's adopted university to bestow them? The university's new vice-chancellor decided that a big dinner, slap-up, to employ a phrase that the dictionary was to quote from 1823, should be held in Murray's honour. It would be staged in the huge hall at the Queen's College, where by old tradition a scholar with a silver trumpet sounds a fanfare to summon guests in to dine. It would celebrate what the Times, on the day of the dinner, proclaimed to be the greatest effort probably which any university, it may be any printing press, has taken in hand since the invention of printing. It will not be the least of the glories of the University of Oxford to have completed this gigantic task. The evening would be a memorable Oxford event, as indeed it was. The long tables were splendidly decorated with flowers, and with all the best silverware and crystal that Queen's could roust from its cellars. The menu was forthright and English: clear turtle soup, turbot with lobster sauce, haunch of mutton, roast partridges, Queen Mab pudding, and strawberry ice. But, like the dictionary itself, it was also flavoured generously, but not too generously, with Gallicisms. Sweetbreads after the mode of Villeroy, grenadines of veal, ramequins. The wines were plentiful and excellent: an 1858 Amontillado sherry, an 1882 Adriatic maraschino liqueur, an aged Chateau d'Yquem, and champagne by Pfungst, 1889. The guests wore white tie, academic robes, medals. During the speeches, and after a loyal toast, in which the graciousness of Her Majesty was duly noted, and her 6 decades on the throne proudly congratulated, they smoked cigars. They must have smoked long and well. There were no fewer than 14 speeches. James Murray on the entire history of dictionary making, the head of the Oxford University Press on his belief that the project was a great duty to the nation, and the egregious Henry Furnivall, as lively and amusing as ever, taking time from recruiting buxom Amazons from the local ABC tea-house to come a-rowing with him, to speak on what he saw as Oxford's heartless attitude toward the admission of women. Among the guests could be counted all the great and the good of the academic land, the editors of the dictionary, the delegates of the press, the printers, members of the Philological Society, and, not least, some of the most assiduous and energetic of the volunteer readers. There was Mr. F.T. Elworthy of Wellington, Miss J.E.A. Brown of Further Barton, near Cister, the Reverend W.E. Smith of Putney, Lord Aldenham, better known by friends of the dictionary as Mr. H. Huck Gibbs, Mr. Russell Martineau, Monsieur F.J. Amour, and for the later parts of D, the Mrs. Edith and E. Peronet Thompson, both of Reigate. The list was long, but so sonorous were the names, and so evidently awesome their achievements. The diners, well into their port and cognac by now, heard them out in a silence that was easy to confuse with rapture. As it happens, the most fulsome remarks made about the volunteers that night relate to 2 men who had much in common. Both were Americans, both spent time in India, Both were soldiers, both were mad, and though both had been invited, neither one came to the dinner. The first was Dr. Fitz-Edward Hall, who came from Troy, New York. His was a bizarre story. Just as he was about to enter Harvard in 1848, his family demanded that he set off for Calcutta to track down an errant brother. His ship was wrecked in the Bay of Bengal. He survived and became fascinated by Sanskrit, studying it to the point where he was eventually offered the chair in Sanskrit at Government College in Varanasi, then called Benares, the holiest city in the Ganges Valley. He fought for the British side during the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857 as a rifleman, then left India in 1860 and became Sanskrit professor at King's College London and librarian at the India Office. And then, quite precipitously, his life fell terribly apart. No one is sure why, except that he had a furious dispute with a fellow Sanskrit scholar from Austria named Theodor Goldstücker. It was a dispute of such gravity — linguists and philologists were known to be mercurial and hold eternal grudges — that it caused Hall to quit the India Office, have himself summarily suspended from the Philological Society, and leave London for a small village in Suffolk. People said he was a drunkard, a foreign spy, hopelessly immoral, and an academic phony. He, in turn, accused all Britons of turning on him, ruining his life, driving away his wife, and displaying only a fiendish hatred of Americans. He turned the key in the lock of his cottage in Milesford, and, except for the occasional steamer voyage back home to New York, lived the life of a near-total country recluse. And yet he wrote every single day to James Murray at Oxford, a correspondence that continued for 20 years. The two men never met, but over the years Hall, without complaint, compiled slips, answered queries, offered advice, and remained the staunchest ally of the dictionary during its bleakest days. Small wonder that Dr. Murray wrote in the great preface, "Above all, we have to record the inestimable collaboration of Dr. Fitz-Edward Hall, whose voluntary labours have completed the literary and documentary history of numberless words, senses, and idioms, and whose contributions are to be found on every page." Those at the dinner knew why he had not come. They knew that he was a hermit, that he was difficult. But no one knew, or so the story has long had it, exactly why the man next mentioned had not turned up. Murray, in writing the celebrated preface, had been almost equally generous in his praise. Also the unflagging services of Dr. W.C. Minor, which have week by week supplied additional quotations for the words actually preparing for press. Second only to the contributions of Dr. Fitz-Edward Hall, Murray was to write a little later, in enhancing our illustration of the literary history of individual words, phrases, and constructions, have been those of Dr. W.C. Minor, received week by week. But where, wondered the gathered assembly, was Dr. Minor? He was living at Crowthorne, only 60 minutes away, by the green and gold steam trains of the Great Western. He was not notorious as an ill-tempered misanthrope like Dr. Hall. His letters had always been noted for their polite solicitousness. So why could he not have had the courtesy to come? To some who dined at Queen's on that glorious autumn evening, Minor's absence must have seemed a melancholy footnote to an otherwise glorious literary moment. The received wisdom has it that Dr. Murray was perplexed, even vaguely irritated. It is said that he vowed, out of all his lexicographic knowledge, to take a leaf from Francis Bacon, who in 1624 had written in English the axiom from the collection of the Prophet's sayings known as the Hadith, to the effect that if the mountain will not come to Mahomet, then Mahomet must go to the mountain. It is said that he promptly wrote to Dr. Minor, his letter supposedly reading as follows: "You and I have now known each other through correspondence for fully 17 years, and it is a sad fact that we have never met. Perhaps it has never proved convenient for you to travel. Maybe it has been too expensive. But while it is difficult indeed for me to leave the work of the scriptorium even for one day, I have long wanted to meet you, and may I perhaps suggest that I come to visit you? If this is convenient, perhaps you might suggest a day and a train, and if convenient for me, I will telegraph the time of my expected arrival." Dr. Miner supposedly wrote back promptly, saying that he would of course be delighted to receive the editor, but he was so sorry that physical circumstances, he did not elaborate, had hitherto made it impossible for him to come up to Oxford, and suggested a number of trains from those listed in the Bradshaw. Murray duly selected a November Wednesday, and a train that, with a change in Reading, was due into the Wellington College railway station shortly after lunch. He telegraphed the details to Crowthorne, wheeling out his faithful black Humber tricycle, and with his white beard blowing over his shoulder in the chilly breeze, set out down the Banbury Road, past the Randolph Hotel, the Ashmolean Museum, and Worcester College, and to the up, or London-bound, platform of Oxford Station. The journey took just a little over an hour. He was pleasantly surprised, on arriving at Crowthorne, to find a brougham and a liveried coachman waiting for him. His long-held assumption that Miner must be a leisured man of letters was reinforced. Perhaps, he thought to himself, he was even a man of means. The horses clip-clopped through the fog-damp lanes. The magnificent pile of Wellington School lay neatly in the distance, a respectable distance from Crowthorne village itself, which was no more than a cluster of cottages, the piles of lawn leaves smouldering behind them. It was a pretty little place, quiet, well-wooded, and rather self-contained. After a couple of miles, the coachman swung the horses into a poplar-lined driveway that climbed a long, low hill. The cottages thinned out, and were replaced by a number of small red-brick houses of a rather more severe look. Then the horses stopped before an imposing front gate, a pair of towers with a great black-faced clock between, and green-painted doors that were being opened by a servant. The editor was perhaps vaguely excited. This must have seemed to him a grand country house in which he was being exceedingly well received, as though expected for a sumptuous afternoon tea, or like someone arriving at Kedleston for luncheon with Lord Curzon. James Murray removed his cap and unbuttoned the Inverness tweed cape that had protected him from the cold. The servant said nothing, but ushered him inside and up a flight of marble stairs. He was swept into a large room with a glowing coal fire and a wall covered with portraits of gaunt-looking men. There was a large oak director's desk, and behind it a portly man of obvious importance. The servant backed out and closed the door. Murray advanced toward the great man, who rose. Murray bowed stiffly and extended his hand. "I, sir, am Dr. James Murray of the London Philological Society," he said in his finely modulated Scottish voice, "and editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. And you, sir, must be Dr. William Miner. At long last, I'm most deeply honoured to meet you." There was a pause, then the other man replied, "I regret not, sir. I cannot lay claim to that distinction. I am the superintendent of the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Dr. Miner is an American, and he is one of our longest-staying inmates. He committed a murder. He is quite insane." Dr. Murray, as the story then continues, was in turn astonished, amazed, and yet filled with sympathetic interest. He begged to be taken to Dr. Miner, and the meeting between the two men of learning who had corresponded for so long, and who now met in such strange circumstances, was an extremely impressive one. The story of this first meeting is, however, no more than an amusing and romantic fiction. It was created by an American journalist named Hayden Church, who lived in London for most of the first half of this century. It first appeared in England in the Strand magazine in September 1915, and then again revised and amplified in the same journal 6 months later. In fact, Church had already tried it out on an American audience, writing anonymously for the Sunday Star in Washington, D.C. in July 1915. The story was splendidly sensationalized, with a kind of lurid, multi-layered headline, that has sadly gone almost out of fashion. "American murderer helped write Oxford Dictionary," read the first, extending over all 8 columns of the page. "Mysterious contributor to an English dictionary proved to be a rich American surgeon confined in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum for a murder committed while he was in a deranged condition. How Sir James Murray, editor of the dictionary, who set out, as he thought, to visit the home of a fellow savant, found himself at the asylum and heard the extraordinary tale, which begins during the American Civil War, when the principal was a surgeon in the Northern Army, contributor wealthy, and now living in America, says his friend." The breathless headline told of an even more exhausting story, but one made more than faintly ludicrous by its author's inability or unwillingness to name Miner. In every reference he is called simply Dr. Blank, as in, "And you, sir, must be Dr. Blank. I am most honored to meet you." The story nonetheless went down well with its American audience, which had been given hints and snippets in the years before. The arrest of one of their officers for murder in London not having passed unnoticed at the time, his imprisonment received occasional dustings off as new correspondents and new diplomats found their way to the English capital. But the revelation of his work for the dictionary was new, and in this regard Haydn Church had a good, old-fashioned scoop. The wires picked the story up, it appeared in papers around the world, and as far away as Tientsin, China. But in London it did not go down so well. Henry Bradley, who by this time had taken over from Murray as editor-in-chief of what was now formally known as the Oxford English Dictionary, took exception to the Strand article. He wrote an angry letter to the Daily Telegraph complaining of several misstatements of fact, and that the story of Dr. Murray's first interview with Dr. Miner is, so far as its most romantic features are concerned, a fiction. Haydn Church dashed off a spirited reply to Bradley, which the Telegraph, naturally liking a fight, happily published. It contains vague rebuttals, citing only a host of correspondents, some of them of great eminence, but none of whom are named, who had confirmed the major aspects of the story. It pleads, limply, that "I have the best of reasons for believing the account of the meeting between Miner and Murray to be accurate." The oddest part of Church's reply, however, is its enigmatic postscript. "I've just been in communication with one of the most distinguished literary men in England, who pointed out that there did not appear in my article what he personally considered the most striking feature of all in the American's history." Strictly true or not, Haydn Church's account of the first meeting turned out to be simply far too good to ignore. It enthralled all England, people said. It took their mind off World War I. 1915, after all, was the year of Ypres, of Gallipoli, of the sinking of the Lusitania, and people were no doubt content to have such a saga as a diversion from the grim realities of the fighting. "No romance," said the Pall Mall Gazette, "is equal to this wonderful story of scholarship in a padded cell." Virtually all subsequent references to the saga of Oxford dictionary making retell Church's story to a greater or lesser degree. In her justly celebrated biography, 1977, of her grandfather, Miss K. M. Elizabeth Murray retells Church's version of events almost without question, as does Jonathan Green in a more general book on the history of lexicography, published in 1996. Only Elizabeth Knowles, an Oxford University Press editor, who became intrigued by the story in the early 1990s, takes a cooler and more detached view. Still, she is clearly perplexed that no definitive account of the first meeting can be found. The patina applied by decades of good use has made the legend pleasingly credible. The truth, however, turns out to be only marginally less romantic. It surfaces in a letter Murray wrote in 1902 to a distinguished friend, Dr. Francis Brown, in Boston, and which turned up in a wooden box in the attic of one of William Miner's very few living relations, a retired businessman living in Riverside, Connecticut. The letter appears to be the full and complete original, although it was the exhausting habit of many letter-writers of the time, to prepare a fair copy of all their outgoing mail, and in so doing occasionally to edit and elide some passages. His first contact with Miner, writes Dr. Murray, came very soon after the beginning of his work in the dictionary, probably 1880 or even 1881. He proved to be a very good reader who wrote to me often, and, as has already been mentioned, Murray thought only that he must be a retired medical man with plenty of time on his hands. By accident my attention was called to the fact that his address, Broadmoor, Crowthorne, Berkshire, was that of a large lunatic asylum. I assumed that, perhaps, he was the medical officer of that institution. But our correspondence was, of course, entirely limited to the dictionary and its materials, and the only feeling I had towards him was that of gratitude for his immense help, with some surprise at the rare and expensive old books that he evidently had access to. This continued for years until one day, between 1887 and 1890, the late Mr. Justin Windsor, librarian of Harvard College, was sitting chatting in my scriptorium, and among other things remarked, "You have given great pleasure to Americans by speaking as you do in your preface of poor Dr. Miner. This is a very painful case." "Indeed?" I said with astonishment. "In what way?" Mr. W. was equally astonished to find that in all these years I had corresponded with Dr. Miner, I'd never learned nor suspected anything about him, and he then thrilled me with his story. The great librarian, for Justin Windsor remains one of the grandest figures in all of 19th-century American librarianship, and a formidable historian to boot, then told the story, which Murray then retold to his friend in Boston. Some of the facts are wrong, as facts tend to be when related over a period of years. Murray says that Miner went to Harvard, while in fact he went to Yale, and repeats the probably apocryphal story that he was driven mad by having to witness the execution of 2 men after a court-martial. He goes on to say that the shooting happened in the Strand, then, unlike now, one of London's more fashionable streets, rather than in the grim purlieus of the Lambeth waterside. But essentially the story is relayed correctly, after which Murray resumes his own narrative. "I was, of course, deeply affected by the story, but as Dr. Miner had never in the least alluded to himself or his position, all I could do was to write to him more respectfully and kindly than before, so as to show no notice of this disclosure, which I feared might make some change in our relations. A few years ago an American citizen who called on me told me he had been to see Dr. Miner, and said he found him rather low and out of spirits, and urged me to go to see him. I said I shrank from that, because I had no reason to suppose that Dr. Miner thought I knew anything about him personally. He said, 'Yes, he does. He has no doubt that you know all about him, and it really would be a kindness if you would go and see him.' I then wrote to Dr. Miner, telling him that, and that Mr. I forget the name, who had recently visited him, had told me that a visit from me would be welcome. I also wrote to Dr. Nicholson, the then governor, who warmly invited me, and when I went drove me from and to the railway station, and invited me to lunch, at which he also had Dr. Miner, who I found was a great favourite with his children. I sat with Dr. Miner in his room, or cell, many hours altogether before and after lunch, and found him, as far as I could see, as sane as myself, a much cultivated and scholarly man, with many artistic tastes, and of fine Christian character, quite resigned to his sad lot, and grieved only on account of the restriction it imposed on his usefulness. I learned, from the governor, I think, that he has always given a large part of his income to support the widow of the man whose death he so sadly caused, and that she regularly visits him. Dr. Nicholson had a great opinion of him, gave him many privileges, and regularly took distinguished visitors up to his room or cell to see him and his books. But his successor, the present governor, has not shown such special sympathy. The meeting took place in January 1891, 6 years earlier than is favoured by the romantics, who repeat the dictionary dinner story. Murray had written to Nicholson asking for permission, and in the letter we can almost feel his childlike, knees-squeezing anticipation of the event. "It will give me great satisfaction to make the acquaintance of Dr. Miner, to whom the dictionary owes so much, as well as yourself, who have been so kind to him. I shall probably come by the train you name, the 12, from Reading, but have not had time to look up the timetable, or rather to ask my wife to do so, for in such matters I deliver myself automatically into her hands, and she tells me, 'Your train starts so-and-so, and you will go by such a train,' and I will come into the scriptorium and fetch you to get ready 5 minutes before. I thankfully comply and do my work until the 5 minutes before arrives." It is now abundantly clear that the two men knew each other personally and saw each other regularly for almost 20 years from that date. The first encounter over lunch was to begin a long and firm friendship, based both on a wary mutual respect and more particularly on their passionate and keenly shared love for words. For both men, the first sight of the other must have been peculiar indeed. They were uncannily similar in appearance. Both were tall, thin, and bald. Both had deeply hooded blue eyes, neither using spectacles, though Miner was profoundly myopic. Dr. Miner's nose looked a little hooked, Dr. Murray's finer and more aquiline. Miner has an air of avuncular kindliness, Murray much the same, but with a trace of the severity that might well distinguish a lowland Scot from a Connecticut Yankee. But what was most obviously similar about the men were their beards, in both cases white, long, and nicely swallow-tailed, with thick moustaches, sideburns, and ample bugger's grips. Both looked like popular illustrations of Father Time. Boys in Oxford would see Murray tricycling by and call out, "Father Christmas," at him. True, Dr. Miner's had a more ragged and unkempt look about it, doubtless because the arrangements for cutting and washing inside Broadmoor were rather less sophisticated than in the outside world. Murray's beard, on the other hand, was fine and well-combed and shampooed, and looked as though no particle of food had ever been allowed to rest there. Miner's was the more homely, while Murray's was more of a fashion statement. But both were magnificently fecund arrangements. When the beards were added to the other collections of the pair's individual attributes, each must have imagined for a second that he was stepping toward himself in a looking-glass rather than meeting a stranger. The two men met dozens of times in the next several years. By all accounts, they liked each other, a liking subject only to Dr. Miner's moods, to which Murray became over the years fully sensitive. He often had the foresight to telegraph Nicholson to ask how the patient was. If low and angry, he would remain at Oxford. If low and likely to be comforted, he would board the train. When the weather was poor, the men would sit together in Miner's room, a small and practically furnished cell, not too dissimilar from a typical Oxford student's room, and just like the room Murray was to be given at Balliol once he was made an honorary fellow. It was lined with bookshelves, all of which were open, except for one glass-fronted case that held the rarest of the 16th and 17th century works from which much of the OED work was being done. The fireplace crackled merrily. Tea and Dundee cake were brought in by a fellow inmate, whom Miner had hired to work for him, one of the many privileges Nicholson, like Orange before him, accorded his distinguished inmate. There was a whole raft of other perks besides. He was able to order books at will from various antiquarian dealers in London, New York, and Boston. He was able to write uncensored letters to whomever he chose. He was able to have visitors more or less at will, and told Murray with some pride that Eliza Merritt, the widow of the man he murdered, would come to his rooms quite frequently. She was not an unattractive woman, he said, though it was thought that she drank rather too much for comfort. He subscribed to magazines, which he and Murray would read to each other. The Spectator was one of his favourites, and Outlook, which was mailed to him by his relations in Connecticut. He took the Athenaeum, as well as the splendidly arcane Oxford publication Notes and Queries, which even today makes puzzling inquiries of the world's literary community about unsolved mysteries of the bookish world. The OED used to publish its word desiderata there. Until Murray began visiting Crowthorne, this was Miner's principal means of finding out which particular words the OED staff were working on. Although the men talked principally about words, most often about a specific word, but sometimes about more general lexical problems of dialect and the nuances of pronunciation, they did, it is certain, discuss in a general sense the nature of the doctor's illness. Murray could not help noticing, for instance, that Miner's cell floor had been covered with a sheet of zinc, to prevent men coming in through the timbers at night, and that he kept a bowl of water beside the door of whichever room he was in, because the evil spirits will not dare to cross water to get to me. Murray was aware, too, of the doctor's fears that he would be transported from his room at night and made to perform deeds of the wildest excess in dens of infamy before being returned to his cell by dawn. Once airplanes were invented, and Miner, being American, kept keenly up to date with all that happened in the years after the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk, he incorporated them into his delusions. Men would then break into his rooms, place him in a flying machine, and take him to brothels in Constantinople, where he would be forced to perform acts of terrible lewdness with cheap women and small girls. Murray winced as he heard these tales, but held his tongue. It was not his place to regard the old man with anything other than sad affection, and besides, his work for the dictionary continued apace. When the weather was fine, the two men would walk together on the terrace, a wide gravel path inside the asylum's south wall, shaded by tall old firs and araucaria, the monkey puzzle tree. The lawns were green, the shrubbery filled with daffodils and tulips, and once in a while other patients would emerge from the blocks to play football, or walk, or sit staring into space from one of the wooden benches. Attendants would lurk in the shadows, making sure there were no outbreaks of trouble. Murray and Miner, hands behind their backs, would walk in step, slowly, back and forth along the 300 yards of the terrace, always in the shadows of either the gaunt red buildings or of the 17-foot wall. They always seemed animated, deep in conversation. Papers were produced, sometimes books. They did not speak to others, and gave the impression of inhabiting a world of their own. Sometimes Dr. Nicholson would invite the pair in for afternoon tea, and on one or two occasions Ada Murray came to Broadmoor too, and remained with Nicholson and his family in the superintendent's comfortably furnished house, while the men pored over the books in the cell or on the gravel walkway. There was always sadness when the time came for the editor to leave. The keys would turn, the gates would clang shut, and Miner would be left alone again, trapped in a world of his own making, redeemed only when, after a day or so of quiet mourning, he could take down another volume from his shelves, select a needed word and its most elegant context, pick up his pen and dip it in the ink to write once more. To Dr. Murray, Oxford. The Oxford post office knew the address well. It was all that was needed to communicate by letter with the greatest lexicographer in the land, and make sure the information got through to him at the scriptorium. Few enough letters between the two men survive. There is a lengthy letter from 1888, in which Miner writes about the quotations containing the word Challoner, an obsolete name for a man who manufactured shalloon, which was a woolen lining material for coats. He is interested, according to a later note, in the word gondola, and finds a quotation from Spenser in 1590. Murray talked about his new friend often, and liked to include him, and indeed with some discreet reference to his condition, in the speeches he was often obliged to make. In 1897, for instance, his notes survive for a speech he was to give at a dictionary evening at the Philological Society. About 15 or 16,000 additional slips received during the past year, half of those supplied by Dr. W.C. Minor, whose name and pathetic story I have often before alluded to. Dr. M. has in reading 50 or 60 books, mostly scarce, of the 16th to 17th century. His practice is to keep just ahead of the actual preparation of the dictionary. 2 years later, Murray felt able to be more fulsome still. The supreme position is certainly held by Dr. W.C. Minor of Broadmoor, who during the past 2 years has sent in no less than 12,000 quarts. Sick. These have nearly all been for the words which Mr. Bradley and I were actually occupied, for Dr. Minor likes to know each month just what words we are likely to be working on during the month, and to devote his whole strength to supplying quotations for those words, and thus to feel that he is in touch with the making of the dictionary. So enormous have been Dr. Minor's contributions during the past 17 or 18 years that we could easily illustrate the last 4 centuries from his quotations alone. But the devotion of his whole strength was beginning to prove taxing, both to his body and his mind. His kindly friend, Dr. Nicholson, retired in 1895, still in pain from being attacked by a patient 6 years earlier, who hit him on the head with a brick concealed in a sock. He was replaced by Dr. Brain, a man selected, for more than his name alone, one trusts, by a Home Office that felt a stricter regime needed to be employed at the asylum. Brain was indeed a martinet, a jailer of the old school, who would have done well at a prison farm in Tasmania or Norfolk Island. But he did as the government required. There were no escapes during his term of office. There had been several before, causing widespread alarm. And in the first year, 200,000 hours of solitary confinement were logged by the more fractious inmates. He was widely feared and loathed by the patients, as well as by Dr. Murray, who thought he was treating Minor heartlessly. And Minor continues to whinge. He complains of a hole in the heel of his sock, doubtless caused by some stranger's shoe into which at night he had been obliged to place his foot. November 1896. Minor is suspicious that his wines and spirits are being tampered with. December 1896. One curious snippet of information came from the United States later that same year, when it was noted, rather laconically, that 2 of Minor's family had recently killed themselves. The letter going on to warn the staff at Broadmoor that great care should be taken, lest whatever madness gripped their patient turned out to have a hereditary nature. But even if the staff thought Minor a possible suicide risk, no restrictions were placed on him as a result of the American information.